friends, welcome back. I'm Christina, the manager from the Pacific Beach Library. It is April 1st, but I ain't fooling. We are about to embark on day 10 of our read along together of Roughing It by Mark Twain. So let's see, we're gonna read 4 chapters. Let's start out by having some tea. My tea today is I think it's called Sweet and Spicy or Spicy and Sweet. I don't remember. It's a herbal tea blend that has like the cinnamon and cloves and a couple of good things like that, and it's delicious, and I've had it before. I always find it really comforting. Let's see. And I think I'm all here on my own. Oh no, somebody else has showed up. Hello, come say hi if you feel like it. Or don't, you don't have to. We'll just sort of chill, drink some tea. If you'd like to say what tea you're drinking, that would be super fun. If not, let's get right into our book. Hello, Pam. Good to see you. Let's see. Let's start talking about our book. I will also mention, just because I can't help myself, I cut my hair off yesterday and I like it, but I'm still trying to figure out how to style it. So yeah, we'll experiment with this over the next few weeks. We'll get to see it grow out over the next few months. I'm hoping by the end of the year, it'll be back to about here. We'll see. You chop it off so you can grow it back. All right, so let's see. Today we're going to talk about 4 chapters. Chapters 35. Oh no, we're going to read 35 to 38, but we're going to talk about what we read on Tuesday, 31 to 34. Let's see. Oh, I did not move my bookmark. This will be fun. All right, let's go back and see what happened in 31 through. Yes. Okay, this was lovely. I remember now. In chapter 31, they were talking about the water. Oh, hey, Pam, you're up in Big Bear? That is super cool. Thank you for visiting and still reading with us. I'm trying to think, Big Bear, not anywhere that Mark Twain got to on this journey during Roughing It, but still a bit more the Wild West than what we have here in civilized San Diego and Pacific Beach, perhaps. I mean, there's bears in the title, right? In the name. In 31, we read about after the floods came to the area where he was staying at. I think it was like, was it Unionville? I can't remember the name of the city, but when the floods came and washed away a lot of the stables and whatnot, he was saying how when the people were stranded, they started getting a little bit stir crazy and they got a little bit antsy and a little bit aggressive, a couple of the people. And he talks about 2 of the men. And one of them was a little Swede, who we'll get to at the end of the chapter, but the other was another gentleman named Arkansas, and Arkansas was rather itching for a fight. And so in a large bit of the chapter, Arkansas is talking to the proprietor of the establishment where they're staying, and he's saying like, like, why are you accusing me of this? And what are you saying about my mother? And all that stuff. And the guy's like, I'm not saying anything against you, Arkansas. I never would. It's like, of course I wouldn't. It's like an I do declare kind of thing. Like, I never would. And, and Arkansas is just like spoiling for a fight. It's like, is that what you're saying? You want me to fight you? You asked me to fight you? No, I'm not trying to get you to fight me. You're trying to fight me, And so he's out for like blood, basically. And it's looking bad until finally the landlord's wife comes out with a pair of scissors and she holds off Arkansas and like basically faces him down. And after that, all the other men are so amused at seeing Arkansas get like cowed down by this little woman with a pair of scissors, no less, that they lose all respect for Arkansas after that. The chapter continues with Mark Twain saying that he and Ollendorf and Ballou were trying to get out of there. They didn't want to have to help clean. They wanted to get an early escape from the hotel or whatever they were staying at. And so they cross the river and they have some problems. Like Ollendorf jumps out early. The little canoe they're in capsizes. The other men get wet, and they're trying to go through the snow. They believe that the little Swede, the other man that he'd mentioned, that he comes out in the snow and he's trying to tramp a trail too, but they believe that he also is never heard from again, so they believe that he probably perished in the snow. And then the next chapter, 32, is really lovely. It's the 3 men who now they're convinced, like, they made it, they couldn't quite make it to the next town. They're not going to make it. They're in the snow. Their horses have run off. They're trying to light a fire and the matches like blow out or won't start, and it's just like they're miserable and they're sure they're going to die. And so they're in the snow together, the three of them, and they basically give up their vices. Like one says, I'm going to stop gambling. Another one's, I'm going to stop playing cards. And it says, I'm going to stop drinking. And Mark Twain says, I will stop smoking my pipe. And he flings his pipe away into the snow. And so all of them, they give up their sins and they decide if they, if they could only live, they would be better men. Then of course, they live. It turns out that they were only like a few feet away from the from where the stables were in the next town, and so they they're both happy to have survived, and they're also thoroughly embarrassed and chagrined that they were so close to rescue and they didn't realize it. Like literally they were about 15 steps away, but just the snow had been so thick that they hadn't been able to see that little distance through that their salvation was there. So then the next chapter, 33, ended with the three men in their upset and shame about what had happened, gradually getting supplanted by the feeling like, I could sure use a smoke or a drink or playing some cards. And so the three of them pick up their old vices again, and they decide not to talk about it. And they're all just going to be not acknowledging their highfalutin resolutions to be better men. Finally, the next thing was we talk a bit about just a story that he'd heard about some men who were playing a trick on General Bunscombe, who had been like the U.S. attorney for the Nevada area, and basically saying how, there was these storms are terrible and treacherous. Like sometimes there'd be landslides, like things would slide down the mountain. And so they're basically saying how Mr. Morgan had a ranch located above a gentleman named Mr. Hyde. And when the storms came, the land, unsettled, and Mr. Morgan's ranch slid down the hill and covered the land that had been owned by Mr. Hyde. And so the idea, again, this is like this, if the property falls down onto another man's property, who owns the property? Because Mr. Morgan, the one from the upper area, was saying, well, I didn't get out of my house. My house is right there. It's still my land. And in fact, my land slid down the mountain. That's still my land that my house is resting on. And the other guy said, well, yeah, but your land is resting on my land. So really it's all my land. So they had this big case. And it looked like Mr. Hyde, the owner of the lower property, was going to win until the judge says, well, actually, it seems like an act of God that he wanted that land to come down. And so really, that's his land on top of the other man's land. But yeah, he does have a right to it. So General Bunscombe is all perturbed about the absurdity of this whole case. And so that is the end of that. Let me just get to my bookmark in place now. All right, let's go ahead and read our next 4 chapters, chapters 35 through 38, or Roughing It. So good. Okay, chapter 35. When we finally left for Esmeralda, horseback, we had an addition to the company in the person of Captain John Nye, the governor's brother. He had a good memory and a tongue hung in the middle. This is a combination which gives immortality to conversation. Captain John never suffered the talk to flag or falter once during the 120 miles of the journey. In addition to his conversational powers, he had 1 or 2 other endowments of a marked character. One was a singular handiness about doing anything and everything, from laying out a railroad or organizing a political party, down to sewing on buttons, shoeing a horse, or setting a broken leg or a hen. Another was a spirit of accommodation that prompted him to take the needs, difficulties, and perplexities of anybody and everybody upon his own shoulders at any and all times, and dispose of them with admirable facility and alacrity. Hence he always managed to find vacant beds in crowded inns, and plenty to eat in the emptiest larders. And finally, wherever he met a man, woman, or child, in camp, inn, or desert, he either knew such parties personally, or had been acquainted with the relative of the same. Such another traveling comrade was never seen before. I cannot forbear giving a specimen of the way in which he overcame difficulties. On the 2nd day out, we arrived, very tired and hungry, at a poor little inn in the desert, and were told that the house was full, no provisions on hand, and neither hay nor barley to spare for the horses. We must move on. The rest of us wanted to hurry on while it was yet light, but Captain John insisted on stopping a while. We dismounted and entered. There was no welcome for us on any face. Captain John began his blandishments, and within 20 minutes he had accomplished the following things, viz., found old acquaintances in 3 teamsters, discovered that he used to go to school with the landlord's mother, recognized his wife as a lady whose life he had saved once in California by stopping her runaway horse, mended a child's broken toy and won the favor of its mother, a guest of the inn, helped the hostler bleed a horse and prescribed for another horse that had the heaves, treated the entire party 3 times at the landlord's bar, produced a ladder paper than anybody had seen for a week, and sat himself down to read the news to a deeply interested audience. The result, summed up, was as follows. The hostler found plenty of feed for our horses. We had a trout supper, an exceedingly sociable time after it, good beds to sleep in, and a surprising breakfast in the morning. And when we left, we were lamented by all. Captain John had some bad traits, but he had some uncommonly valuable ones to offset them with. Esmeralda was, in many respects, another Humboldt, but in a little more forward state. The claims we had been paying assessments on were entirely worthless, and we threw them away. The principal one cropped out of the top of a knoll that was 14 feet high, and the inspired board of directors were running a tunnel under that knoll to strike the ledge. The tunnel would have to be 70 feet long, and would then strike the ledge at the same depth that a shaft 12 foot deep would have reached. The board were living on the assessments. N.B. This hint comes too late for the enlightenment of New York silver miners. They have already learned all about this neat trick by experience. The board had no desire to strike the ledge, knowing it was as barren of silver as a curbstone. This reminiscence calls to mind Jim Townsend's tunnel. He had paid assessments on a mine called the Daly till he was well nigh penniless. Finally, an assessment was levied to run a tunnel 250 feet on the Daly, and Townsend went up the hill to look into matters. He found the Daly cropping out of the apex of an extremely sharp-pointed peak, and a couple of men up there facing the proposed tunnel. Townsend made a calculation. Then he said to the men, "So you have taken a contract to run a tunnel into this hill, 250 feet, to strike this ledge?" "Yes, sir." "Well, do you know that you have got one of the most expensive and arduous undertakings before you that was ever conceived by man?" "Why, no. How is that?" "Because this hill is only 25 feet through from side to side, and so you have got to build 225 feet of your tunnel on trestle work." The ways of silver mining boards are exceedingly dark and sinuous. We took up various claims and commenced shafts and tunnels on them, but never finished any of them. We had to do a certain amount of work on each to hold it, else other parties could seize our property after the expiration of 10 days. We were always hunting up new claims and doing a little work on them, and then waiting for a buyer, who never came. We never found any ore that would yield more than $50 a ton, and as the mills charged $50 a ton for working ore and extracting the silver, our pocket money melted steadily away, and none returned to take its place. We lived in a little cabin and cooked for ourselves, and altogether it was a hard life, though a hopeful one, for we never ceased to expect fortune and a customer to burst upon us some day. At last, when flour reached $1 a pound and money could not be borrowed on the best security at less than 8% a month, I being without the security too, I abandoned mining and went to milling. That is to say, I went to work as a common laborer in a quartz mill at $10 a week and board. And now chapter 36. I had already learned how hard and long and dismal a task it is to burrow down into the bowels of the earth and get out the coveted ore. And now I learned that the burrowing was only half the work, and that to get the silver out of the ore was the dreary and laborious other half of it. We had to turn out at 6 in the morning and keep at it till dark. This mill was a 6-stamp affair, driven by steam. 6 tall, upright rods of iron, as large as a man's ankle, and heavily shod with a mass of iron and steel at their lower ends, were framed together like a gate, and these rose and fell, one after the other, in a ponderous dance, in an iron box called a battery. Each of these rods or stamps weighed 600 pounds. One of us stood by the battery all day long, breaking up masses of silver-bearing rock with a sledge and shoveling it into the battery. The ceaseless dance of the stamps pulverized the rock to powder, and a stream of water, pulverized The ceaseless dance of the stamps pulverized the rock to powder, and a stream of water that trickled into the battery turned it into a creamy paste. The minutest particles were driven through a fine wire screen, which fitted close around the battery, and were washed into great tubs warmed by superheated steam. Amalgamating pans, they are called. The mass of pulp in the pans was kept constantly stirred up by revolving mullers. A quantity of quicksilver was kept always in the battery, and this seized some of the liberated gold and silver particles and held on to them. Quicksilver was shaken in a fine shower into the pans also, about every half hour, through a buckskin sack. Quantities of coarse salt and sulfate of copper were added from time to time to assist the amalgamation by destroying base metals which coated the gold and silver and would not let it unite with the quicksilver. All these tiresome things we had to attend to constantly. Streams of dirty water flowed always from the pans and were carried off in broad wooden troughs to the ravine. One would not suppose that atoms of gold and silver would float on top of 6 inches of water, but they did. And in order to catch them, coarse blankets were laid in the troughs, and little obstructing riffles charged with quicksilver were placed here and there across the troughs also. These riffles had to be cleaned and the blankets washed out every evening to get their precious accumulations. And after all this eternity of trouble, 1/3 of the silver and gold in a ton of rock would find its way to the end of the troughs in the ravine at last and have to be worked over again some day. There is nothing so aggravating as silver milling. There never was any idle time in that mill. There was always something to do. It is a pity that Adam could not have gone straight out of Eden into a quartz mill in order to understand the full force of his doom to earn his bread by the sweat of his brow. Every now and then during the day, we had to scoop some pulp out of the pans and tediously wash it in a horn spoon. Wash it little by little over the edge, till at last nothing was left but some little dull globules of quicksilver in the bottom. If they were soft and yielding, the pan needed some salt or other sulfate of copper or some other chemical rubbish to assist digestion. If they were crisp to the touch and could retain a dint, they were freighted with all the silver and gold they could seize and hold, and consequently the pans needed a fresh charge of quicksilver. When there was nothing else to do, one could always screen tailings. That is to say, he could shovel up the dried sand that had washed down to the ravine through the troughs and dash it against an upright wire screen to free it from pebbles and prepare it for working over. The process of amalgamation differed in the various mills, and this included changes in style of pans and other machinery, and a great diversity of opinion existed as to the best in use. But none of the methods employed involved the principle of milling ore without screening the tailings. Of all recreations in the world, screening tailings on a hot day with a long-handled shovel is the most undesirable. At the end of the week, the machinery was stopped and we cleaned up. That is to say, we got the pulp out of the pans and batteries and washed the mud patiently away till nothing was left but the long accumulating mass of quicksilver with its imprisoned treasures. This we made into heavy, compact snowballs and piled them up in a bright, luxurious heap for inspection. Making these snowballs cost me a fine gold ring, that and ignorance together, for the quicksilver invaded the ring with the same facility with which water saturates a sponge, separated its particles, and the ring crumbled to pieces. We put our pile of quicksilver balls into an iron retort that had a pipe leading from it to a pail of water, and then applied a roasting heat. The quicksilver turned to vapor, escaped through the pipe into the pail, and the water turned it into good, wholesome quicksilver again. Quicksilver is very costly, and they never waste it. On opening the retort, there was our week's worth, a lump of pure white, frosty-looking silver, twice as large as a man's head. Perhaps 1/5 of the mass was gold, but the color of it did not show. Would not have shown if 2/3 of it had been gold. We melted it up and made a solid brick of it by pouring it into an iron brick mold. By such a tedious and laborious process were silver bricks obtained. This mill was but one of many others in operation at the time. The first one in Nevada was built at Egan Canyon and was a small, insignificant affair and compared most unfavorably with some of the immense establishments afterwards located at Virginia City and elsewhere. From our bricks, a little corner was chipped off for the fire assay, a method used to determine the proportions of gold, silver, and base metals in the mass. This is an interesting process. The chip is hammered out as thin as paper and weighed on scales so fine and sensitive that if you weigh a 2-inch scrap of paper on them and then write your name on the paper with a coarse, soft pencil and weigh it again, the scales will take marked note of the addition. Then a little lead, also weighted, is rolled up with the flake of silver, and the two are melted at a great heat in a small vessel called a cupel, made by compressing bone ashes into a cup shape in a steel mold. The base metals oxidize and are absorbed with the lead into the pores of the cupel. A button, or globule of perfectly pure gold and silver, is left behind, and by weighing it and noting the loss, the assayer knows the proportion of base metal the brick contains. He has to separate the gold from the silver now. The button is hammered out flat and thin, put in the furnace, and kept some time at a red heat. After cooling it off, it is rolled up like a quill and heated in a glass vessel containing nitric acid. The acid dissolves the silver and leaves the gold pure and ready to be weighed on its own merits. Then salt water is poured into the vessel containing the dissolved silver, and the silver returns to palpable form again and sinks to the bottom. Nothing now remains but to weigh it. Then the proportions of the several metals contained in the brick are known, and the assayer stamps the value of the brick upon its surface. The sagacious reader will know now, without being told, that the speculative miner, in getting a fire assay made of a piece of rock from his mine to help him sell the same, was not in the habit of picking out the least valuable fragment of rock on his dump pile, but quite the contrary. I have seen men hunt over a pile of nearly worthless quartz for an hour, and at last find a little piece as large as a filbert, which was rich in gold and silver, and this was reserved for a fire assay. Of course, the fire assay would demonstrate that a ton of such rock would yield hundreds of dollars, and on such assays, many an utterly worthless mine was sold. Assaying was a good business, and so some men engaged in it occasionally, who were not strictly scientific and capable. One assayer got such rich results out of all specimens brought to him that in time he acquired almost a monopoly of the business. But like all men who achieve success, he became an object of envy and suspicion. The other assayers entered into a conspiracy against him and let some prominent citizens into the secret in order to show that they meant fairly. Then they broke a little fragment off a carpenter's gridstone and got a stranger to take it to the popular scientist and get it assayed. In the course of an hour, the result came, whereby it appeared that a ton of that rock would yield $1,284.40 in silver and $366.36 in gold. Due publication of the whole matter was made in the paper, and the popular assayer left town between 2 days. I will remark in passing that I only remained in the milling business 1 week. I told my employer I could not stay longer without an advance in my wages, that I liked quartz milling, indeed was infatuated with it, that I had never before grown so tenderly attached to an occupation in so short a time, that nothing, it seemed to me, gave such scope to intellectual activity as feeding a battery and screening tailings, and nothing so stimulated the moral attributes as retorting bullion and washing blankets. Still, I felt constrained to ask an increase of salary. He said he was paying me $10 a week and thought it a good round sum. How much did I want? I said about $400,000 a month, and board was about all I could reasonably ask, considering the hard times. I was ordered off the premises, and yet, when I look back to those days and call to mind the exceeding hardness of the labor I performed in that mill, I only regret that I did not ask him $700,000. Shortly after this, I began to grow crazy, along with the rest of the population, about the mysterious and wonderful cement mine, and to make preparations to take advantage of any opportunity that might offer to go and help hunt for it. And now chapter 37. It was somewhere in the neighborhood of Mono Lake that the marvelous Whiteman cement mine was supposed to lie. Every now and then it would be reported that Mr. W. had passed stealthily through Esmeralda at dead of night in disguise, and then he would have a wild excitement because he must be steering for his secret mine, and now was the time to follow him. In less than 3 hours after daylight, all the horses and mules and donkeys in the vicinity would be bought, hired or stolen, and half the community would be off for the mountains, following in the wake of white men. But W would drift about through the mountain gorges for days together in a purposeless sort of way until the provisions of the miners ran out, and then they would have to go back home. I have known it reported at 11 o'clock at night in a large mining camp that white men had just passed through, and in 2 hours the streets, so quiet before, would be swarming with men and animals. Every individual would be trying to be very secret, but yet venturing to whisper to just one neighbor that W had passed through. And long before daylight, this in the dead of winter, the stampede would be complete, the camp deserted, and the whole population gone chasing after W. The tradition was that in the early immigration, more than 20 years ago, 3 young Germans, brothers, who had survived an Indian massacre on the plains, wandered on foot through the deserts, avoiding all trails and roads, and simply holding a westerly direction and hoping to find California before they starved or died of fatigue. And in a gorge in the mountains, they sat down to rest one day, when one of them noticed a curious vein of cement running along the ground, shot full of lumps of dull yellow metal. They saw that it was gold, and that here was a fortune to be acquired in a single day. The vein was about as wide as a curbstone, and fully 2/3 of it was pure gold. Every pound of the wonderful cement was worth well nigh $200. Each of the brothers loaded himself with about 25 pounds of it, and when they covered up all traces of the vein, made a rude drawing of the locality and the principal landmarks of the vicinity, and started westward again. But troubles thickened about them. In their wanderings, one brother fell and broke his leg, and the others were obliged to go on and leave him to die in the wilderness. Another, worn out and starving, gave up by and by and laid down to die. But after 2 or 3 weeks of incredible hardships, the third reached the settlements of California, exhausted, sick, and his mind deranged by his sufferings. He had thrown away all his cement but a few fragments, but these were sufficient to set everybody wild with excitement. However, he had had enough of the cement country, and nothing could induce him to lead a party thither. He was entirely content to work on a farm for wages. But he gave white men his map, and described the cement region as well as he could, and thus transferred the curse to that gentleman. For when I had my one accidental glimpse of Mr. W. and Esmeralda, he had been hunting for the lost mine in hunger and thirst, poverty and sickness for 12 or 13 years. Some people believed he had found it, but most people believed he had not. I saw a piece of cement as large as my fist, which was said to have been given to white men by the young German, and it was of a seductive nature. Lumps of virgin gold were as thick in it as raisins in a slice of fruitcake. The privilege of working such a mine 1 week would be sufficient for a man of reasonable desires. A new partner of ours, a Mr. Higby, knew white men well by sight, and a friend of ours, a Mr. Van Dorn, was well acquainted with him, and not only that, but had Whiteman's promise that he should have a private hint in time to enable him to join the next cement expedition. Van Dorn had promised to extend the hint to us. One evening, Higby came in greatly excited and said he felt certain he had recognized Whiteman uptown, disguised and in a pretended state of intoxication. In a little while, Van Dorn arrived and confirmed the news, and so we gathered in our cabin and with heads close together arranged our plans in impressive whispers. We were to leave town quietly after midnight in 2 or 3 small parties so as not to attract attention, and meet at dawn on the divide overlooking Mono Lake, 8 or 9 miles distant. We were to make no noise after starting and not speak above a whisper under any circumstances. It was believed that for once Whiteman's presence was unknown in the town and his expedition unsuspected. Our conclave broke up at 9 o'clock, and we set about our preparations diligently and with profound secrecy. At 11 o'clock, we saddled our horses, hitched them with their long riatas, or lassos, and then brought out a side of bacon, a sack of beans, a small sack of coffee, some sugar, 100 pounds of flour in some sacks, some tin cups and a coffee pot, frying pan, and some few other necessary articles. All these things were packed on the back of a led horse, and whoever has not been taught by a Spanish adept to pack an animal, let him never hope to do the thing by natural smartness. That is impossible. Higby had had some experience, but was not perfect. He put on the paddle sack, a thing like a sawbuck, piled the property on it, and then wound a rope all over and about it and under it, every which way, taking a hitch in it every now and then, and occasionally surging back on it till the horse's sides sunk in and he gasped for breath. But every time the lashings grew tight in one place, they loosened in another. We never did get the load tight all over, but we got it so that it would do after a fashion, and then we started, in single file, close order, and without a word. It was a dark night. We kept the middle of the road and proceeded in a slow walk past the rows of cabins, and whenever a miner came to his door, I trembled for fear the light would shine on us and excite curiosity. But nothing happened. We began the long, winding ascent of the canyon toward the divide, and presently the cabins began to grow infrequent, and the intervals between them wider and wider, and then I began to breathe tolerably freer and feel less like a thief and a murderer. I was in the rear, leading the pack horse. As the ascent grew steeper, he grew proportionately less satisfied with his cargo and began to pull back on his riata occasionally and delay progress. My comrades were passing out of sight in the gloom. I was getting anxious. I coaxed and bullied the pack horse till I presently got him into a trot, and then the tin cups and pans strung about his person frightened him, and he ran. His riata was wound around the pommel of my saddle, and so, as he went by, he dragged me from my horse, and the two animals traveled briskly on without me. But I was not alone. The loosened cargo tumbled overboard from the pack horse and fell close to me. It was abreast of almost the last cabin. A miner came out and said, "Hello?" I was 30 steps from him and knew he could not see me. It was so very dark in the shadow of the mountain. So I lay still. Another head appeared in the light of the cabin door, and presently the two men walked toward me. They stopped within 10 steps of me, and one said, "St, listen." I could not have been in a more distressed state if I had been escaping justice with a price on my head. Then the miners appeared to sit down on a boulder, though I could not see them distinctly enough to be very sure what they did. One said, "I heard a noise as plain as I ever heard anything. It seemed to be about there." A stone whizzed by my head. I flattened myself out in the dust like a postage stamp and thought to myself, if he mended his aim ever so little, he would probably hear another noise. In my heart now, I execrated secret expeditions. I promised myself that this should be my last, though the Sierras were ribbed with cement veins. Then one of the men said, "I'll tell you what, Welch knew what he was talking about when he said he saw white men today. I heard horses. That was the noise. I'm going down to Welch's right away." They left, and I was glad. I did not care whither they went, so they went. I was willing they should visit Welch, and the sooner the better. As soon as they closed their cabin door, my comrades emerged from the gloom. They had caught the horses and were waiting for a clear coast again. We remounted the cargo on the pack horse and got underway, and as day broke, we reached the divide and joined Van Dorn. Then we journeyed down into the valley of the lake and, feeling secure, we halted to cook breakfast, for we were tired and sleepy and hungry. 3 hours later, the rest of the population filed over the divide in a long procession and drifted off out of sight around the borders of the lake. Whether or not my accident had produced this result, we never knew, but at least one thing was certain. The secret was out, and white men would not enter upon a search for the cement mine this time. We were filled with chagrin. We held a council and decided to make the best of our misfortune and enjoy a week's holiday on the borders of the curious lake. Mono, it is sometimes called, and sometimes the Dead Sea of California. It is one of the strangest freaks of nature to be found in any land, but it is hardly ever mentioned in print and very seldom visited, because it lies away off the usual routes of travel, and besides it is so difficult to get at that only men content to endure the roughest life will consent to take upon themselves the discomforts of such a trip. On the morning of our second day, we traveled around to a remote and particularly wild spot on the borders of the lake, where a stream of fresh, ice-cold water entered it from a mountainside, and then we went regularly into camp. We hired a large boat and 2 shotguns from a lonely ranchman who lived some 10 miles further on, and made ready for comfort and recreation. We soon got thoroughly acquainted with the lake and all its peculiarities. And now chapter 38 of Roughing It. Mono Lake lies in a lifeless, treeless, hideous desert, guarded by 8,000 feet above the level of the sea, and is guarded by mountains 2,000 feet higher, whose summits are always clothed in clouds. This solemn, silent, sailless sea, this lonely tenant of the loneliest spot on earth, is little graced with the picturesque. It is an unpretending expanse of grayish water, about 100 miles in circumference, with 2 islands in its center, mere upheavals of rent and scorched and blistered lava, snowed over with gray banks and drifts of pumice stone and ashes, the winding sheet of the dead volcano, whose vast crater the lake has seized upon and occupied. The lake is 200 feet deep, and its sluggish waters are so strong with alkali that if you only dip the most hopelessly soiled garment into them once or twice and wring it out, it will be found as clean as if it had been through the ablest of washerwomen's hands. While we camped there, our laundry work was easy. We tied the week's washing astern of our boat and sailed a quarter of a mile, and the job was complete, all to the wringing out. If we threw the water on our heads and gave them a rub or so, the white lather would pile up 3 inches high. This water is not good for bruised places and abrasions of the skin. We had a valuable dog. He had raw places on him. He had more raw places on him than sound ones. He was the rawest dog I almost ever saw. He jumped overboard one day to get away from the flies, but it was bad judgment. In his condition, it would have been just as comfortable to jump into a fire. The alkali water nipped him in all the raw places simultaneously, and he struck out for the shore with considerable interest. He yelped and barked and howled as he went, and by the time he got to the shore, there was no bark to him, for he had barked the bark all out of his inside, and the alkali water had cleaned the bark all off his outside, and he probably wished he had never embarked in any such enterprise. He ran round and round in a circle and pawed the earth and clawed the air and threw double somersaults, sometimes backward and sometimes forward, in the most extraordinary manner. He was not a demonstrative dog, as a general thing, but rather of a grave and serious turn of mind, and I never saw him take so much interest in anything before. He finally struck out over the mountains at a gait which we estimated at about 250 miles an hour, and he is going yet. This was about 9 years ago. We look for what is left of him along here every day. A white man cannot drink the water of Mono Lake, for it is nearly pure lye. It is said that the Indians in the vicinity drink it sometimes, though. It is not improbable, for they are among the purest liars I ever saw. There will be no additional charge for this joke, except to parties requiring an explanation of it. This joke has received high commendation from some of the ablest minds of the ages. There are no fish in Mono Lake. No frogs, no snakes, no pollywigs. Nothing, in fact, that goes to make life desirable. Millions of wild ducks and seagulls swim about the surface, but no living thing exists under the surface, except a white feathery sort of worm, 1/2 an inch long, which looks like a bit of white thread frayed out at the sides. If you dip up a gallon of water, you will get about 15,000 of these. They give to the water a sort of grayish-white appearance. Then there is a fly, which looks something like our housefly. These settle on the beach to eat the worms that wash ashore, and any time you can see there a belt of flies 1 inch deep and 6 feet wide, and this belt extends clear around the lake, a belt of flies 100 miles long. If you throw a stone among them, they swarm up so thick that they look dense, like a cloud. You can hold them under water as long as you please. They do not mind it. They are only proud of it. When you let them go, they pop up to the surface as dry as a patent office report and walk off as unconcernedly as if they had been educated especially with a view to affording instructive entertainment to man in that particular way. Providence leaves nothing to go by chance. All things have their uses and their part and proper place in nature's economy. The ducks eat the flies eat the worms. The Indians eat all 3. The wildcats eat the Indians, the white folks eat the wildcats, and thus all things are lovely. Mono Lake is 100 miles in a straight line from the ocean, and between it and the ocean are 1 or 2 ranges of mountains. Yet thousands of seagulls go there every season to lay their eggs and rear their young. One would as soon expect to find seagulls in Kansas. And in this connection, let us observe another instance of nature's wisdom. The islands in the lake being merely huge masses of lava, coated over with ashes and pumice stone, and utterly innocent of vegetation or anything that would burn. The seagull's eggs being entirely useless to anybody unless they be cooked, nature has provided an unfailing spring of boiling water on the largest island, and you can put your eggs in there, and in 4 minutes, you can boil them as hard as any statement I have made during the past 15 years. Within 10 feet of the boiling spring is a spring of pure, cold water, sweet and wholesome. So in that island, you get your board and washing free of charge. And if nature had gone further and furnished a nice American hotel clerk who was crusty and disobliging and didn't know anything about the timetables or the railroad routes, or anything, and was proud of it, I would not wish for a more desirable boarding house. Half a dozen little mountain brooks flow into Mono Lake, but not a stream of any kind flows out of it. It neither rises nor falls, apparently, and what it does with its surplus water is a dark and bloody mystery. There are only 2 seasons in the region round about Mono Lake, and these are the breaking up of one winter and the beginning of the next. More than once, in Esmeralda, I have seen a perfectly blistering morning open up with the thermometer at 90 degrees at 8 o'clock, and seen the snow fall 14 inches deep, and that same identical thermometer go down to 47 degrees under shelter before 9 o'clock at night. Under favorable circumstances, it snows at least once in every single month in the year in the little town of Mono. So uncertain is the climate in summer that a lady who goes out visiting cannot hope to be prepared for all emergencies unless she takes her fan under one arm and her snowshoes under the other. When they have a 4th of July procession, it generally snows on them, and they do say that it's a general thing when a man calls for a brandy toddy there, the barkeeper chops it off with a hatchet and wraps it up in a paper, like maple sugar. And it is further reported that the old soakers haven't any teeth, wore them out eating gin cocktails and brandy punches. I do not endorse that statement. I simply give it for what it is worth. And it is worth, well, I should say millions to any man who can believe it without straining himself. But I do endorse the snow on the 4th of July, because I know that to be true. That concludes today's reading. I don't know if we'll find out more about Mono Lake next time or if he'll go on to the mines, but thank you for joining me for today's reading from Roughing It by Mark Twain. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll look forward to seeing y'all next week. Bye, friends.